Hi, today I want to discuss different ways to handle inventory and encumbrance. This might seem straightforward, but there are actually many different ways to handle this, and this can significantly change the experience of the entire game. I'll go over a couple of examples and then state my own preferences. Before we jump in, let's briefly define what we're talking about. Inventory. In the context of RPGs, this simply refers to the list of stuff that you're carrying. And encumbrance is what happens when you carry too much stuff. This might represent a simple limit, or perhaps slow you down or make certain activities harder when you exceed a certain weight or number of items. Let's go over some examples. So here we see the equipment section for D&D 5e in D&D Beyond. Here we have armor, and as you see, each type of armor has a different weight. So leather armor weighs 10 pounds, but something like plate mail weighs 65 pounds. So that's quite a lot, of course. We'll scroll down, then we see weapons here. So a dagger just weighs 1 pound, a great club weighs 10 pounds, and so on. And here we have various types of adventuring gear. So a bundle of arrows weighs a pound, a blanket weighs 3 pounds, white clothes. Everything has a specific weight in here. So on your character sheet, you simply track each individual item and add up all the weight. For consumable items like arrows, you simply track the exact count. So as we saw, a bundle of arrows weighs 1 pound and it has 20 arrows. So each time you shoot an arrow, you update the number of remaining arrows on your sheet. And after a combat, you can generally recover half of your spent arrows by spending some time searching the area. So now, what are the effects of carrying too much stuff? That's all explained here in the section for the strength attribute. And by default, 5e doesn't focus too much on encumbrance. So here we're looking at the lifting and carrying rules. So as you see, your carrying capacity is your strength score multiplied by 15. And that's how many pounds worth of stuff you can carry. And then, of course, you can, push things or lift things that are heavier than you can normally carry. So up to 30 times your strength score. But of course, then, you can't really move very quickly. You can only move like 5 feet per round. And then it describes how to adapt this to smaller or larger creatures who can carry more relative to their strength. Note that there's a variant rule for encumbrance. According to this, if you carry more than 5 times your strength score, you are encumbered, which means that your speed drops by 10 feet. And if you carry more than 10 times your strength score up to your maximum carrying capacity, which is still 15 times your strength score, you are heavily encumbered and your speed drops by 20 feet. You also get disadvantage on ability checks, attack rolls, and so on. So this introduces a little bit more realism, perhaps, and for some games that might be what you want. Now let's look at Old School Essentials as a representative example of an old school D&D edition. So interestingly, OSE, just like the original Basic Expert Edition, uses coins as its unit of weight, as opposed to pounds or some other more typical unit. And the effect of carrying too much weight is that your movement rate is reduced. OSE actually offers 2 options here. There's basic encumbrance and detailed encumbrance. So with basic encumbrance, you only care about the treasure that you carry, and you don't worry about armor, weapons, or other adventuring gear. If you're carrying a significant amount of treasure, which is a little bit arbitrary, kind of up to the GM to decide what's significant, your movement rate is reduced. How much depends on the type of armor that you wear. So if you're unarmored, for example, your movement speed goes down from 120 to 90. And with detailed encumbrance, you track the weight of everything that you carry. You still use coins as a unit though. So depending on how many coins worth of stuff you carry, your movement rate is reduced. And here you see the weight of different weapons and armors. So for example, a leather armor weighs 200 coins, basically, and a chainmail weighs 400 coins. A battle axe weighs 50 coins, and a dagger weighs 10 coins. So it's a little bit of an odd legacy way of measuring weight, I guess, but I suppose it works fine and makes it pretty straightforward to trade off treasure against other items that you might want to carry with you. Now, a lot of systems have introduced more abstract ways of tracking your inventory, and we'll look at a couple of those now. So here we have the Black Hack, which is a relatively modern rules-light game that's not a retro clone, but it does emulate that sort of gameplay, and actually it's pretty easy to convert existing D&D adventures for use with the Black Hack. Let's look at the inventory section here. All right, so here we have the inventory section, and as you see, the Black Hack uses slot-based inventory. So a character can happily carry a number of items up to or equal to their strength. So if they have a strength of, say, 11, right, which might be pretty average, they can carry 11 items. And then carrying more items than their strength means they are encumbered, and all attribute tests are taken with disadvantage. And characters simply cannot carry a number of items more than double their strength. So that's pretty straightforward. And note that there's no official impact on movement rate here. But of course, the GM can use their judgment here. Rulings over rules, right? This is actually a fairly common way of handling inventory these days. And many of the newer OSR games use a similar approach, where you can carry a number of items based on your strength or con stat. So Cairn and Knave are examples, as well as Morkborg and its various derivatives like Pirateborg, for example. But the Black Hack introduces another innovation, and that's usage dice. These are used for tracking consumable items such as arrows. So rather than tracking each individual arrow, for example, you assign a so-called usage die to the bundle of arrows. So if we look here, we see that arrows or other ammunition starts at a usage die of a D8. UD8 is the notation they use. So you start with a D8, and after a combat, you roll that die, so a D8 at the beginning, and on a score of 1 or 2, you downgrade it to the next lower die, so a D6 in this case, and so on. And once you roll a 1 or 2 on a D4, the item is used up. This table here actually shows the sort of statistically, to be expected number of uses for each usage die based on which one you start with. So for our arrows example, with a D8 usage die, you typically expect to get 9 uses out of a bundle of arrows. If you were to start with a D20, you would get around 30 uses. However, since a D20 is so large and somewhat swingy, right, it's much less predictable. You could end up getting a lot more out of it or a lot less. So my understanding is that large usage dice like D20 typically are not recommended to be used. I think officially the Black Hack doesn't use a usage die of D20 for anything. At least I didn't see anything. A D12 is used for things like the duration of spells or diseases. So it's worth pointing out that usage dice can be used for other things than tracking, arrows. They can be used for durations and things like that. Anything where you need some sort of fuzzy number of items or duration. I don't actually have a lot of experience with the Black Hack, but I do like the idea of usage dice. I actually incorporated this as a house rule in a D&D 5e campaign when I ran Hot Springs Island. but it ended up falling through the cracks most of the time, so I decided to just ignore it for that campaign. I'll talk a bit more about my preferences later. Let's take a quick look at Shadowdark. Shadowdark uses slot-based inventory similar to the Black Hack. As you see down here under gear slots, you can carry a number of items equal to your strength stat, or 10, whichever is higher. There's no mention of penalties after that. It's just a simple and pretty low actually max. Compare that to the Black Hack, which we just looked at. There you can carry up to twice your strength. It just means that if you're carrying more than your strength worth of items, you are encumbered and you have disadvantage on attribute tests. But in Shadowdark, rules as written, you simply cannot carry more than strength worth of items. And that's actually significant here for a specific reason. And that's about how it handles consumables, or specifically torches. Arrows, as you see here, they're actually simply counted, just like in D&D, no usage dice or anything like that. But torches last for an hour of real time. So yes, actual real time. So if you and your friends sit around the table for 3 hours while your characters explore a dungeon, your group uses up 3 torches. Or lantern oil works the same way. The recommendation is to start a timer whenever you light a torch. This is relevant because darkness plays an important role in this game. Bad things tend to happen when you're caught without light in a dungeon, and there are actually tips for game masters to effectively attack your light source, right? Monsters might try to extinguish your torches because they can sort of see in the dark and characters can't. So darkness is an important element in this game, and that's why I think this rule will actually work really well. I was initially a bit on the fence about it when I first heard about it, but I now think that this will work super well and add an interesting sort of real-time tension and a bias for action on behalf of the players to the game, right? And you really have to make difficult trade-offs about do you carry some more rations, or do you carry another torch? Do you carry a treasure bag and drop your torches and risk that, right? Or not. So personally, I can't wait to get this to the table at some point. I want to show one more OSR style game that has its own very cool spin on slot-based inventory. And that's Mausritter, Sword and Whiskers role-playing. Let's look at the Mausritter character sheet real quick. As you see here, Mausritter uses actual physical cardboard pieces that are placed on the character sheet. The sheet has an area that represents the backpack, that's these items, these 6 items down here, as well as an area for the character's hands and body. In Mausritter, equipment actually defines your character's abilities. There are no classes, talents, or other specializations outside of equipment. So even things like magic ability is handled by equipping spells, for example. This turns out to be very tactile and fun in play. Here's some actual equipment, right? So you see that you might have like this needle here as a sort of light weapon, or a dagger, or perhaps a mace as a medium weapon, right? But these are all still pretty small. Or you might carry a warhammer, a heavy weapon, and this one actually takes up 2 slots. So you won't be able to carry a shield, for example, in your other hand. And same with armor, right? You have your heavy armor here, which takes up 2 slots, light armor, things like that. Here are other items, lanterns and torches. Not all that different from Shadowdark, I guess. An interesting aspect of Mausritter is that conditions are actually also handled as inventory. So when your character becomes exhausted or perhaps frightened, they actually have to take this card and put it into their inventory. So it means that as a result of being exhausted, they can now carry less inventory. So they have to drop something. That's actually a really cool mechanic, I think, a really cool way to handle that. I'm not sure how well all of this would work for an extended campaign, but it works really well for one-shots. It does make it a bit more awkward to keep the character sheets in between sessions. You have to use an envelope so the cardboard pieces don't get lost. But it's really neat. I like it. Moving away from D&D and OSR games, let's look at a different type of game, Blades in the Dark. Blades in the Dark uses what you might call quantum inventory. So here we see what a Blades in the Dark playbook looks like. That's basically the character sheet, but it includes all of the information for playing this specific type of character. So here we have a cutter, a dangerous and intimidating fighter. For each mission, you choose your loadout. You don't pick actual items. You just choose whether you want to have a light loadout, normal, or heavy. And you choose the actual items later during the session based on what you actually need at the time. If we look at this playbook, you see this sort of section to the right. This is kind of the generic equipment that each playbook has access to. So this includes things like throwing knives, a pistol, climbing gear, documents, arcane implements, a lantern, and so on. But then also each playbook has their own specific items that only they have access to. So the cutter, for example, has access to a fine hand weapon or a fine heavy weapon, which takes up 2 slots, or perhaps a rage essence vial. If we look at the hound, they're more of a sharpshooter, right? So they have a couple of ranged weapons here that they can get access to, or a spyglass. Or the leech has tinkering tools and wrecking tools and a blowgun. But again, they don't have those items. Those are just accessible to them, right? And they can choose to spend a slot on it. So with a light loadout, you can choose during the session up to 3 items. So for example, going back to our cutter, they might choose a fine hand weapon, if it turns out that they need this, and maybe armor, right? If they later encounter some heavily armed enemies. So that's 2 slots for the armor, 1 for the fine hand weapon, and that's all they can carry with a light loadout. If they went in with a normal loadout, they would have 2 additional slots available. Now, the cost of choosing a heavier loadout is that you look more conspicuous. It'll be much harder to get into places unnoticed. This fits really well with the rest of the Blades in the Dark mechanics, which are all about removing upfront planning and instead using dice rolls to determine the player's starting situation and then using flashbacks to retroactively declare things they've planned all along. It's actually surprisingly elegant in play. I haven't seen this exact sort of quantum inventory in a lot of games, but I think it works really well for games like this. Last not least, let's talk about Cortex Prime. Cortex Prime is a generic game, or rather a toolkit for building your own custom games. It provides a core mechanic, but most of the game consists of so-called mods, modular rules that you can pick and choose from to assemble your own game. Cortex Prime is very narrative-oriented and is all about emulating various genres, as opposed to simulating real-world physics. As such, equipment typically plays a secondary role in Cortex games. Most items simply give you narrative permission to do something rather than having detailed stats. For example, if you possess a gun, you can attack from a distance. But Cortex also has a concept of assets and signature assets. Both types of assets possess narrative and mechanical weight in form of a die that is added to the dice pool when the item is used. Assets are items or other benefits that you can gain during a scene. For example, you might be facing some goons in a back alley. You look around and you grab a metal pipe as a weapon. Or perhaps you suddenly remember that you have a contact at the local newspaper that might have some valuable intel for you. Mechanically, gaining an asset generally involves either a roll or spending a plot point to call this item into existence. The item usually only lasts for the rest of the scene, but you can spend additional plot points to make it last for the entire session. In contrast, signature assets are an important aspect of your character and generally available to them at all times. Note again that assets don't have to be physical items. Assets can represent things such as organizational ties or contacts. Let's look at an example. So here we see the character sheet that I made for my own homebrew Cortex Prime adventure, which I'm calling Zombies of the Caribbean. It's sort of a zombies versus pirates setting. So this is a pre-gen character. This is a surgeon, and as you see, the surgeon carries a surgical kit as a signature item, which gives them an extra D8 whenever they perform a medical procedure. And then let's look at some of the other pre-gens. So the sailor gets a trusty old grappling hook and line. The swashbuckler gets my grandfather's fancy rapier. And all of those give them a D8 in appropriate situations. The carpenter gets a tool chest. The brute has a trained falcon in this case, and so on. Overall, I really like this sort of loose approach to equipment. It's a little bit similar to Blades in the Dark's quantum inventory, but it doesn't lock you into a specific load type from the beginning. Note that Cortex Prime doesn't have any specific rules for encumbrance. It's simply not that type of game. I would simply use my own judgment. For example, if a pirate carries a barrel of gunpowder, they are likely very slow and can't take any other actions. Of course, if Inventory and Encumbrance plays a more important role in your particular Cortex Prime game, you could certainly introduce your own mods to handle this. So, that's quite a few different ways of handling inventory and encumbrance, and this is just a small selection of games. There are many other games that have their own very specific ways of handling these things. Which approach do I prefer? Most of these are pretty reasonable, and it really comes down to the experience that I'm looking to emulate. As you may know, I tend to enjoy fairly lightweight games, without a ton of tracking and math. Therefore, I'm not a fan of the default D&D approach of tracking the actual weight of items. I've actually played an old school Essentials one-shot before, where we spent about an hour adventuring, followed by what felt like another hour of calculating and discussing how we're going to get all the treasure back to town. And while that may be fun for some players, I found it incredibly boring and tedious, so I can rule that approach out for my own games. I do like the idea of slot-based inventory a lot, so that seems like a nice sweet spot. It introduces some constraints that require difficult decisions and trade-offs without requiring a ton of math and tracking. I admit that I don't have a ton of experience playing or running games with slot-based inventory though. And I think a lot of it comes down to the details. I've definitely heard that some games may need some tweaks to work well at the table. As for tracking consumables, I'm actually particularly interested in Shadowdark's real-time torches. I could see this adding a really unique and tense element to the game that I'd love to try out myself. I don't actually have significant problems tracking individual arrows and bullets. That's what we do in our Fallout 2D20 game, for example, and it's really not a big deal. So if some level of scarcity of resources is an important aspect of the game, I'm perfectly fine with this. The usage die seems like a fine middle ground as well. It's a reasonably elegant mechanic, but as I mentioned, this sort of fizzled out the one time I tried to use it, so it would require a bit more discipline on my part. Which perhaps shows my overall bias towards simply hand-waving all of this stuff. That's what I tend to prefer. Again, unless the experience that I'm going for specifically requires resource scarcity and tracking. I'm also a fan of how Blades in the Dark and Cortex Prime handle equipment as well. For a narrative-focused game, I love those approaches and would pick those over detailed inventory tracking anytime. As a side note, this topic applies to video games as well. I know there are many gamers that enjoy dealing with detailed inventory and resource management, making difficult trade-offs, buying or crafting better items, and so on. Myself, I find this super tedious, so I actually stopped playing Baldur's Gate 3 because of the tedious inventory management, especially because you have to manage the inventory for your entire party of characters. So, as with everything, this all comes down to personal preferences. When starting a new campaign, consider discussing this topic with your players in Session 0. If you're playing a gritty game, where resources are critical for survival, and if everyone's on board with more realistic inventory and encumbrance rules, then choose one of those approaches and give it a shot. If not, perhaps just handwave it and simply use your judgment. That means if the party's thief is trying to sneak while carrying 2 large bronze statues under their arms, you may want to impose some heavy penalties on their die roll. Well, that's it for now. Why don't you leave a comment to let me know about your favorite way of handling inventory? As always, likes and subscribes are appreciated as well. See you next time!